He is currently consultant ophthalmologist, Birmingham Children's Hospital in Oxford in the UK. The title which published is Therapeutic Options in Pediatric Ocular Myasthenia Gravis. Please,
Thank you, Professor Lim. Some of this has already been covered by previous speakers, and unfortunately there is going to be a bit of an overlap. So I'll try and skip through the parts where I think my slides have already been covered previously. I think it's probably fair to say that what Dr. Kedar is doing is probably the right end, which is if you've got a problem with the wiring, you're fixing the wiring. What we are doing is working at the wrong end, because we are trying to fiddle with the bulb when the problem is with the wiring. But we'll talk about the various treatment options and what we can do as ophthalmologists as well. So what are the considerations? When I get a patient with myasthenia, one thing to look at is the age. If the child is really young, we're all pediatric ophthalmologists, you've got to think about amblyopia. How long are you going to leave that lid lying down? How long are you going to leave that eye exotropic or esotropic? Look at the ethnicity, because it has a bearing on the treatment. What type of myasthenia are you dealing with? Is it congenital, acquired, transplacental? What's the antibody status? What's the degree and pattern of ocular involvement? Is there any concomitant systemic involvement? And are there associated conditions? For example, there may be a thymoma, which has been dealt with by previous speakers, or whether there's any coexistent thyroid eye disease, which is incredibly rare in a child. Now, transient neonatal myasthenia occurs in about 10% of infants born to affected mothers. It lasts for weeks and it resolves spontaneously. They may be weak feeding, sucking, breathing, or crying. And in severe cases, plasma exchange may be needed. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because you may see a child with a unilateral ptosis. There's a risk of amblyopia in this child. If the ptosis persists beyond 6 weeks, then you're worried that this child will start to go amblyopic. But if you investigate the mother, and if you find that this is a case of transient neonatal myasthenia, then all you have to do is perhaps do something temporary like we did here, which is tape up the lid, and in a few weeks it will go away. So you avoided this surgery on this child simply by testing the mother, by taking the right approach to the diagnosis. And as you can see in this case, it improved in a matter of weeks. The congenital myasthenic syndromes, I think, are far more a medical condition, and there's a whole range of Rapsin positive and other myasthenic syndromes, and we're learning a lot more about them through their genetics. And of course, their treatment options are different because they don't always respond well to pyridostigmine, and there's lots of other treatment options such as 3,4-DAP and fluoxetine. And it's interesting because fluoxetine was considered to be a drug which the psychiatrists use, but it's very, very useful in congenital myasthenic syndrome. So I won't dwell too much on this, but move on to autoimmune myasthenia gravis, which is what most of us see in our practice. Usually onset after 1 year, more common in females, more common in Orientals, which is why I mentioned ethnicity. That's again very relevant when treating as well, and I'll come to that in a minute. There may be associated autoimmune disorders, and it's very rarely associated with a thymoma. What about seronegative myasthenia? I'm very sorry about this. 40 to 60% of ocular myasthenia gravis are seronegative, and there is a better long-term prognosis for cases of seronegative myasthenia. What's worth remembering, there's about 70% of cases of seronegative myasthenia will be anti-MuSK positive. So remember, of that small group that are seronegative, or not a small group, a significant group, 70% could be, up to 70% could be anti-MuSK positive. And MuSK positivity is associated with systemic disorders like bulbar weakness and tongue wasting. So as ophthalmologists, it's important to be aware of these problems so that you can make the appropriate referral. Now, I'm not going to dwell upon making the diagnosis because obviously everyone has talked about this, but the last point I'm going to highlight is that the diagnosis is uncertain, and it may be a clinical diagnosis in a significant number of cases. And as my previous speaker has alluded to, when you have an uncertain diagnosis, rather than just embarking on treatment of myasthenia, broaden your thinking. Think of all the conditions that the previous speaker has alluded to, because it could be one of those. Medical management, pyridostigmine is the typical drug that we start these patients on. I'll come to the dose in a minute. We also use immune modulators like steroids and steroid-sparing agents. There are newer autoimmune disorder treatments for autoimmune conditions, thymectomy and plasma exchange. Now, what we do in our clinic is, for pyridostigmine, we'll start with a typical dose of about 7 milligrams per kilo. That's the typical dose, 7 milligrams per kilogram per day. But we tend to start at a lower dose, divide it into 4 times a day, and gradually increase it over 4 to 6 weeks to see what response we get. Now, a proportion of pediatric myasthenia, pediatric ocular myasthenia will respond to pyridostigmine, but some cases won't. And the ones that don't, which are up to 60% of the ocular myasthenic cases, you might have to give steroids. Steroids don't have to be given long term, you might just have to give them for 3 or 6 months, and we give up to 1 milligram per kilogram per day. You can use steroid-sparing agents such as azathioprine or mycophenolate, and in some cases you might have to use rituximab. I must say, we haven't had to use rituximab in any of our cases either. So although it is a theoretical treatment option, it's not something that we have to use much in practice. We don't encounter life-threatening situations as ophthalmologists, but if such a situation arises, then intravenous immunoglobulin or plasmapheresis may be required. Just one word about thymectomy. With ocular myasthenia gravis that's spreading systemically, a thymectomy would be a good option. Or in autoimmune myasthenia gravis that is unresponsive to treatment. I'll dwell a little bit about surgical management because that's what I tend to do in my practice. I work with a neurologist and we co-manage these patients. The timing of surgery, the type of surgery, and the choice of anesthesia, these are all very, very relevant. The children who present with ptosis, the ptosis is usually variable, fatigable, and alternating. As I mentioned, it might be amblyogenic. The paper that Dr. Kedar had referred to by Martin Cooper-Smith showed that about 70% of patients will stabilize at 2 years with medical treatment. So that's about the time where you would want to consider surgical treatment, unless, of course, there was something pressing, something urgent, and if the child had risk of amblyopia. And there is persistent ptosis, and if there is weakness of the levator, then a brow suspension operation is a very good option. Using silicone is better than any others because it's a reversible treatment, and very importantly in these cases, you must examine for the Bell's phenomenon and check the orbicularis power. This is a young girl with ocular myasthenia. You can see she presented with a ptosis. Lift up the lid, her eyes are perfectly aligned. But watch what happens when she tries to close her eyes. She's got weak orbicularis. Now that's relevant because if a ptosis does not respond to medical treatment and you have to carry out any surgical treatment, you're putting her at significant risk of lagophthalmos, incomplete lid closure. And that's what you get after ptosis correction. You get incomplete closure, and it's quite significant. So beware of these cases, and you might have to settle for a suboptimal ptosis correction. You might not want to go for the cosmetically the best result. You might want to leave it slightly undercorrected so that there's adequate corneal protection in these cases. With strabismus, they get unusual patterns, as has already been alluded to by earlier speakers. The muscles that are typically involved are the inferior oblique, the inferior rectus, and the medial rectus. So you get a pseudo-internuclear ophthalmoplegia. And this is an example of a case with pseudo-internuclear ophthalmoplegia. You can see there's a limitation of adduction of that left eye. There's limitation of adduction of the right eye as well. So this is bilateral involvement. This is a patient who had an exotropia. There was underaction of the medial rectus, but there was also underaction, as you can see, of the left inferior rectus. So inferior rectus and medial rectus underaction can coexist in these cases, and it's a slightly unusual pattern. You've got to think about myasthenia in these sort of cases. This is another example of inferior rectus underaction. This is a girl who was operated for an exotropia after several years of stability following medical treatment. And you can see that it's in these sort of cases, it's quite useful to carry out surgery which is reversible in case the myasthenia starts to improve, although that's usually unlikely. And you don't want to be operating on muscles that are non-functional. So usually what we do is we rely a lot more on recessions than resections. So large recessions, possibly combined with resection of a muscle which is weaker, will give you a good result. Amblyopia, as I said, is very rare because of the variable nature of the strabismus and usually later age of onset. Because it's an incomitant strabismus, the amblyopia is less likely. Now, I had a word with my anesthetist about what he would do in any cases of pediatric myasthenia. And these were his suggestions. He said they're sensitive to volatile anesthetics, they're sensitive to non-depolarizing muscle relaxants. So avoid any muscle relaxants if you can. If you have to use something, then use cis-atracurarium rather than atracurarium. A combination of sevoflurane and propofol works extremely well. A bit of fentanyl for pain relief works very well with these cases. And very importantly, if your anesthetist asks you, do you want this child to be breathing spontaneously with a laryngeal mask, or do you want this child to be paralyzed and ventilated with a tube? Go for the latter. You don't know how much muscle weakness there is. If you keep that child breathing spontaneously and you find that there's muscle weakness and their carbon dioxide levels start to rise, not such a good idea. So right at the outset, maintain control by paralyzing, intubating and ventilating the child. There are some drugs to be avoided: calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, gentamicin, quinolone derivatives, morphine, and some of the contrast agents, because these children will have MRI scans. So it's worth remembering that. The long-term outcome, as we know, it is a progressive disease, and about 80% or more will get generalized over time. So these cases require lifelong surveillance. It's very, very important that a pediatrician is involved in the management of these cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. So we have two more free paper presentations. The Congress has had the